Redemption's Beginning, the Red Harlow Story. Chapter 1, A Vow of Vengeance. The sun hung low in the sky like a dying flame, bleeding orange across the endless stretch of desert. A boy no older than 13 knelt in the sand, one hand clutching the still warm revolver of his father, the other trembling as he reached toward the two lifeless bodies that had once been his entire world. Red Harlow didn't cry. Not when his mother's glazed eyes stared heavenward, lips parted as though she'd tried to call his name one last time. Not when his father, Nate Harlow, lay face down in the dirt with his hand inches from the silver revolver he'd taught Red to shoot with. Not even when the man with the scarred face, Griffin, walked away with blood on his hands and gold in his saddlebags. Red just memorized everything. The gunmetal glint of the revolvers. The way the killer's voice dropped to a sneer when he called Nate a has-been prospector. The sigil burned into Griffin's glove. A black serpent coiled around a pickaxe. Red carved that symbol into his mind like a grave marker. From that moment, Red Harlow died. In his place rose something colder, quieter, a ghost built from vengeance and silence. He spent the next few years with an old bounty hunter named Grizzly, a grizzled, half-sober man with a crooked back and a loaded past. Grizzly found him wandering near the edge of Brimstone, dirty and near-starved, dragging his father's revolver like a talisman. Rather than turn him in or run him off, the old man took him in. "You got that look in your eye, boy," he muttered, pouring a glass of cheap rye, the kind that don't come out except after blood's been spilled. "I seen it before." Red never spoke of his parents. He didn't need to. Instead, he trained. Grizzly taught him to shoot, to track, to survive, how to listen more than speak, how to live in shadows, and how to die with a gun in your hand. But even Grizzly couldn't chip away at the stone building in Red's chest. It wasn't hatred, it was colder than that. Something calculated, patient. By 16, Red was already working bounties. By 20, he was a name whispered in saloons and wanted posters. His revolver, silver with an ivory grip, became infamous. Some said he never missed, others said he never blinked. Both were true, but vengeance wasn't a straight line. It zigzagged through broken towns and dying empires. It passed through crooked lawmen, bloodthirsty outlaws, and the ashes of an American dream. Then, a lead. Red caught wind of a man named Colonel Darren, a disgraced military man turned enforcer for a corrupt mining company called the Cobra Mining Syndicate. It didn't take long for Red to realize the syndicate's crest matched the one he'd burned into memory all those years ago. The coiled serpent, the pickaxe, a connection. He hunted Darren to a border town called Widow's Rest, a dusty pit of gamblers, gunslingers, and snake oil peddlers. Red walked into the saloon like death in boots. No one challenged him, except the man he was looking for. "You're Nate Harlow's whelp, ain't ya?" Darren slurred, half drunk and fully armed. "Your daddy died crying like a dog." The bark of Red's revolver cut off the laughter. No duel, no warning, just one clean shot through Darren's chest. Justice was never poetic, just efficient. Among Darren's belongings, Red found correspondence, letters marked by the Cobra seal, signed by G. They mentioned federal interests, land acquisitions, and something called the Atlas contract. Whatever Griffin was involved in now, it was bigger than gold. Red wasn't just avenging two deaths anymore. He was unraveling a noose looped around the throat of the frontier itself. But as Red chased the syndicate westward, he started seeing something new. Whispers of organized gangs rising from the chaos. One name in particular kept coming up, Dutch van der Linde. An idealist, they said. A killer with poetry on his lips and madness in his heart. His gang was growing, drawing in strays and lost souls and causing enough trouble to get federal attention. Red didn't care yet. He wasn't one for causes or creeds, but he knew corruption when he saw it. The same kind of rot that had destroyed his family now lived in governments and railroads, in men who wore badges and drank with bankers. He saw it in Dutch's eyes, once from across a canyon near Blackwater. Just a glimpse. Dutch was leading a heist on a military convoy, his gang outnumbered but undeterred. Red was there for another bounty, an ex-syndicate man who'd gone freelance. But he paused when he saw Dutch. They looked at each other for only a second. Two men shaped by violence, standing on opposite edges of the same cliff. Then Dutch smiled. Red didn't return it. He just turned away, muttering to himself, another fire waiting to burn. Years would pass before that fire reached its peak. But for now, Red had one name on his lips, one man left to find, Griffin, the serpent's head, and this time he wouldn't miss. Chapter 2, Baptism by Gunpowder. The frontier didn't hand out justice, it buried it. Red Harlow rode with the wind at his back and blood in his wake. Towns he passed through never remembered his arrival, only the silence that followed his departure. His reputation as a bounty hunter grew with each name crossed off his list. But to Red, the work was never about the bounty. It was about the trail. Each job led him closer to the men who'd helped Griffin destroy his family. Each shot fired brought the puzzle into focus. He became a ghost with a badge, a vigilante hired by the law but answering only to memory. The next piece of that puzzle came from a Comanche camp near the Colorado border. Word had spread of a pale-skinned gunslinger fighting off raiders to protect a local trading outpost. Red didn't expect to find an old friend there, let alone one who still remembered his real name. "Red?" Shadow Wolf asked, his voice carrying both surprise and recognition. "I thought you were dead," Red nodded once. "Almost was. Been chasing ghosts ever since." They sat by the fire that night, beneath stars that had watched generations rise and fall. Shadow Wolf, now a respected warrior among his people, told Red of the growing sickness across the land. Railroad companies pushing west, destroying sacred grounds, hiring mercenaries and killers to make room for progress. One name kept coming up. General Diego. Red stiffened. Diego had once served under Griffin during the Mexican campaigns. He was more than a soldier. He was a zealot, a man obsessed with wealth, glory, and something else, something older. Rumors claimed he was gathering men, fortifying an ancient site in the mountains of Nuevo Paraíso. Some said he believed the land itself held a hidden power. Red knew better. He remembered his father speaking in hushed tones about an artifact, something golden, ancient, split in two and hidden away by men who feared its influence. Nate Harlow had once been its guardian. Now the other half was in Diego's hands. Shadow Wolf offered to ride with him, but Red refused. "This is my war," he said, rising from the firelight. "I can't afford to lose anyone else to it." Shadow Wolf placed a hand on his shoulder, then handed him a bone-handled knife. "Then carry my spirit with you." Red rode south. He arrived in Las Hermanas just in time to see Diego's enforcers executing a group of villagers suspected of aiding rebels. Red's fingers twitched toward his revolver, but he waited, watched. He needed more than vengeance. He needed information. That night, he snuck into the local garrison, blades silent, eyes alert. In the command tent, he found maps, letters, orders, proof that Diego was after something buried beneath the Sierra de Oro. Coordinates, shipment manifests, strange sketches of symbols that mirrored the etchings on the half of the artifact his father once kept hidden. And then a voice. "You have the eyes of your father." Red spun, gun drawn. The man before him wore the uniform of a syndicate officer, but he held no weapon. His hair was silver, his face weathered by war and time. His name was Captain Darrell, a former associate of Nate Harlow, now deep within the syndicate's ranks. "I warned your father," Darrell said, told him to walk away, but he believed in something, and that's always dangerous out here. Red hesitated. "You helped kill him?" "No," Darrell said, looking away, "but I didn't stop it either." Red lowered his revolver only slightly. "Why are you telling me this?" Darrell sighed. "Because Diego is insane. He believes that artifact is a key, not just to treasure but to power, influence. He thinks he's chosen by something beyond men." Red's voice was steel. "Where is he?" "In a fortress buried in the cliffs. But it's not just him anymore. The Pinkertons are interested now. They've sent someone to negotiate." Red's breath caught. "Who?" Darrell didn't answer. He only gave him a name on a crumpled piece of parchment. Edgar Ross. Red didn't know the man. Not yet. But the name would return to him, years later, whispered on the winds of another man's tragedy. He left the garrison in flames. By dawn, Las Hermanas was free. Diego fled into the mountains, his artifact half secured in a vault beneath stone and steel. Red followed the trail, fending off mercenaries, bounty hunters, and syndicate guards. He wasn't just a hunter anymore. He was a symbol. He met allies along the way. Jack Swift, a British duelist with a heart for theatrics and a taste for danger. Annie Stokes, a rancher turned renegade who'd lost her land to the syndicate. Each owed something to the world Red was trying to burn down, and each, in their own way, followed him. They joined forces to infiltrate Diego's stronghold. The battle that followed was a storm of smoke and fury. Red confronted Diego beneath the vaults, where ancient stone walls echoed with gunfire. They fought like titans, old world and new, fury and obsession clashing in the dark. In the end, Red stood victorious, Diego's blood soaking the ancient floor. He retrieved the artifact half and studied its surface. It wasn't gold. Not really. It was older than gold, marked by runes and etched symbols that pulsed faintly in the light. Red didn't care what it meant, only what it cost. He left it where it lay. As he rode back into the desert, the legend of Red Harlow grew larger. But the man behind it grew quieter, more distant. Jack Swift called him the Red Hand of Judgment. Annie said he was the last real gunman left in the West. But Red only saw himself as a man shaped by fire, a vessel for justice that no longer had a home. And in the shadows of a growing gang somewhere up north, Dutch vendor Linda heard tales of a lone rider who took down armies and left empires to rot, a flicker of envy, a whisper of fear. Dutch always hated legends he didn't write himself. Chapter 3, The Price of Vengeance. The desert stretched endlessly before him, golden and cruel. Red Harlow had walked through fire and bullets, crossed borders soaked in blood, and shattered the operations of the Cobra mining syndicate. But the fire in his chest still burned. He had Diego's piece of the artifact, but it wasn't gold he'd come for. Not really. It was truth. And truth had a name, Governor Griffin. In the years since his parents' murder, Red had hunted down bandits, mercenaries, corrupt lawmen, and even military officers. But all signs now pointed to the man sitting comfortably behind a desk in Brimstone, shaking hands with railroad barons and federal agents. Red didn't ride straight into town. He watched from the cliffs first, long enough to see the changes. Brimstone had grown since he was a child. The saloons were still loud, the gallows still busy, but new buildings had risen, marble, iron, and glass. Pinkerton agents stood at street corners like crows, their long coats hiding revolvers and silence. The future was moving in, and it was wearing a badge. Red didn't belong here anymore. But he had unfinished business. He paid a visit to an old contact, Professor Perry, a drunken archaeologist with a knack for finding ancient things and selling them to the highest bidder. Red found him in a tent outside the ruins of an old Spanish mission, drunk on tequila and full of secrets. "You're too late," Perry slurred, brushing sand off an ancient scroll. "Griffin already won, got the legislature wrapped around his finger and the army in his pocket. And that pretty little artifact, it's on display in his estate, centerpiece of his collection." Red raised an eyebrow. "So he doesn't know it's a key?" "Oh, he knows," Perry said with a bitter laugh. "But it's more than that. The Atlas contract wasn't just about gold, it was about control. Your father tried to stop it, paid the price." Perry tossed Red a worn envelope. Inside were faded documents bearing Nate Harlow's signature, maps, and something else, a letter. Red read it silently. "If anything happens to me, it's Griffin. He was there from the start. Tell Red to run. Don't let him get pulled into this. He deserves better." The handwriting was shaky, his father's. Red folded the letter carefully and placed it in his coat pocket, close to his chest. He didn't run. That night, Red returned to Brimstone. The streets were quieter under moonlight. Lanterns flickered, and the click of his spurs echoed like a ghost. He made his way through alleyways and back streets, avoiding the main thoroughfare. The Griffin estate stood like a monument at the edge of town. White stone walls, iron gates, and armed guards patrolling the perimeter. He'd expected that. What he hadn't expected was a face from the past. "Jack Swift," Red whispered, as the dashing duelist appeared from the shadows, twirling a gold coin between his fingers. "I heard you were coming," Jack said, grinning. "Thought you might need a distraction." Red tilted his head. "What's the angle?" Jack shrugged. "Griffin's been trying to buy up my father's estate. Figured I'd return the favor by burning down a piece of his." With that, Jack walked toward the front gate, tossed the coin at a guard, and drew his pistols with theatrical flair. Gunshots rang out like thunder. Red slipped through the chaos, scaling a side wall and breaking into the estate through a servant's door. Inside, the opulence was overwhelming. mahogany, velvet, imported art, but Red only had eyes for the study. There in a glass case sat the second half of the artifact, polished, revered, a symbol of everything Red hated. He shattered the glass and grabbed it. As he turned to leave, the doors burst open, and there he was, Governor Griffin. Older now, gray at the temples, but the sneer hadn't changed. "Well, well," Griffin said, arms crossed. "The Harlow boy. I always knew you'd come back." Red didn't move. His revolver was already drawn. Griffin chuckled. "You think killing me changes anything? I built this state, the syndicate, the Atlas contract. It was always bigger than your daddy's farm." "You killed them," Red said flatly. "You ordered it." Griffin raised a brow. "And I'd do it again. Nate should have stayed quiet. We offered him a future. He chose sentiment." Red's hand twitched. "But here's the difference between you and me, son," Griffin continued. "You're still living in the past. I'm building the future." Red fired. The bullet hit center mass. Griffin staggered, clutching his chest, falling against the bookcase as blood spread like ink across his tailored vest. He gasped, then laughed, just once, before collapsing. It was over, or so Red thought. Chapter 4, Riders in the Mist. There comes a point when a man looks over his shoulder and sees nothing but dust and death. Red Harlow had chased his demons across deserts, through canyons and blood-soaked corridors of power. He'd hunted down every man tied to the murder of his parents and the corruption of the frontier. Governor Griffin was dead. The Cobra mining syndicate had been gutted. The two halves of the mysterious artifact were buried far from civilization, sealed beneath rock and memory. And yet, Red felt no peace. He wandered after that, aimless, like smoke drifting from the last embers of a dying fire. For the first time in years, he had no destination. Just the road, the horizon, and the heavy silence that followed a man who had outlived his enemies. He rode east. The plains gave way to forests, then mountains. Red avoided towns when he could. He wasn't running, but he wasn't looking to be found either. The West had changed. The old breed was dying off, replaced by polished boots and barbed wire, by suits and surveyors with maps and ink that claimed land faster than any gun. One evening, as rain rolled over the highlands of Roanoke Ridge, Red took shelter in a crumbling watchtower once used by border scouts. Lightning carved the sky, and thunder chased it close behind. Red sat by a dying fire, cloak wrapped around his shoulders, staring into the glow like it might offer an answer. That's when he heard the voices. Two riders, young by their tone, argued below the hill. One had the sharp bark of command. The other was calmer, more thoughtful. "Shouldn't be out here," said the first. "We're supposed to be scouting north." "I'm telling you, I saw smoke," the second replied. "Someone's camping up here." Red didn't reach for his revolver yet. He'd been tracked too many times to mistake an accident for coincidence. Footsteps approached. The first man burst into view, cocky and soaked in rain. His pistol was drawn, but it wavered when he saw Red, silent, unmoving, one hand resting on his revolver, the other on a hunting knife. The second rider appeared behind him, eyes narrowing. "Easy now," the second man said. "We're not looking for trouble." Red didn't speak. The first rider regained his bravado. "You law? You running from something?" The second elbowed him. "Leave it." Red finally spoke, voice low and gravel-worn. "You boys part of a gang?" The second man paused, then nodded. "Sort of. More like a family." That's when Red noticed it, a worn red scarf tied to the second rider's belt. Faded but familiar. Vanderlinde. The name stung like old shrapnel. He'd heard whispers on the wind. Dutch Vanderlinde, the outlaw with ideals sharper than his bullets, preaching freedom while robbing trains. Red had once seen Dutch from afar, years back during the Diego operation. Now his disciples were creeping into the east like storm clouds. The second rider must have seen recognition in Red's eyes. "You know Dutch?" Red nodded slowly. "Crossed paths once." The first rider stepped forward, chin raised. "If you've got a problem with Dutch, you've got a problem with us." Red stood, his full height casting a long shadow across the fire. "I don't have problems," he said. "Just memories." The second rider stepped between them. "Wait, what's your name?" Red considered lying. Then he didn't. "Harlow." The second rider blinked. "Red Harlow? Thought you were dead." "I am," Red said, walking past them into the mist. They didn't follow. A few weeks later, Red found himself in a quiet corner of Ansburg, helping a miner escape a crooked foreman. It wasn't for money. It was instinct, reflex, maybe. Some part of him still pulled toward justice, no matter how tarnished. Word traveled, as it always did. Not long after, a letter arrived at a local inn addressed to Mr. Harlow. The ink was clean, the signature bold. Dutch van der Linde. Red read it 3 times before tossing it in the fire. Dutch wanted to meet. He spoke of ideals, of forging a new West from the ashes of greed. He said Red could be a symbol, a living legend for the next generation. The words reeked of ambition, masquerading as purpose. Red knew the type. He'd seen what men like Dutch became when their ideals met real blood. Still, curiosity lingered. Red agreed to a meeting on neutral ground, an old cabin west of Valentine, surrounded by trees and silence. Dutch arrived alone, dressed in black with silver trim, eyes gleaming like a snake beneath a preacher's hat. They talked for an hour. Dutch was charming, articulate, and full of fury at the world. He spoke of liberty, of building something greater than banks and governments. Red listened, and then he said one word: control. Red stood. You sound just like Griffin. Dutch didn't flinch. And you sound like a man who wasted his war. Red walked out. As he left, Dutch called after him, voice still calm. You think justice is enough? That revenge changes anything? You're just a ghost with a pistol, Red. I'm the future. Red didn't answer. He didn't look back. That night, a Pinkerton agent named Milton watched their meeting from a distant hill, scribbling notes into a ledger. 2 ghosts had crossed paths, and now the agency had eyes on both. Red vanished after that. Some say he died out there in the forests, buried beneath the roots of trees older than the war for the West. Others claim he returned to Brimstone in disguise, living quietly as a trapper or carpenter. A few believe he wandered into the territory Dutch would later flee through, Amberino, the north, the snow-covered peaks. Arthur Morgan heard stories, a silent gunslinger who hunted outlaws not for money but for balance. A man who once killed a governor and buried a piece of the old world. He never found proof. But the name lingered, Red Harlow, the man who walked out of legend and refused to stay. Chapter 5, Crossing the Line. The fire had gone out long ago. Red Harlow wandered through the high country of Amberino, where pine trees whispered secrets and the wind tasted like snow. He kept no name, no address, just a horse, a rifle, and a face etched with time. In the valley towns, folks called him the Quiet Rider. Some said he was a ghost. Others swore he was dead. Red didn't correct them. He didn't care much for people anymore. But the world had a way of clawing men back. It began with a scream. He was riding along Donner Gorge, where mist crawled across the cliffs like a living thing, when he heard it, sharp, pained, close. He found the source quickly. A young woman, no older than 20, pinned beneath a fallen horse. Her dress was torn, her rifle snapped, but her eyes burned with fight. Red dismounted without a word. He lifted the horse, just enough for her to drag herself out, and then let it fall with a grunt. She scrambled back, panting, blood on her temple. Red tipped his hat and turned to leave. "Wait," she said. "You're him, aren't you?" Red paused. "I seen drawings," she said. "Back in New Austin, posters, etchings, Red Harlow, the bounty hunter." Red turned slowly. "Name doesn't mean much anymore." "To me it does," she said. "Name saved my life." Her name was Clara Wright, and she'd been running from something too. The O'Driscoll boys. They'd burned her homestead, killed her father, taken her brother. She'd been riding north to find help. Any help. But the mountains had teeth. Red listened as she spoke, her voice cracking, her fists clenched. He could have walked away, should have. But something in her reminded him of himself. The fire, the grief. The same fury that once burned in him still lived in her. And maybe, just maybe, he was tired of being a ghost. They rode south together, down through Cumberland Forest, across the Dakota River. Clara had been right. The O'Driscolls were still active, meaner now, scattered into smaller groups after Dutch van der Linde's gang drove them from the heartlands. But remnants remained, wolves with nothing left but bloodlust. Red and Clara found them near Flatneck Station, 6 of them, drunk on moonshine and rage, celebrating around a fire. Clara wanted to rush in, but Red stopped her. "You want revenge?" he asked. "I want my brother back." "Then be patient." They waited until night fell harder. Then Red moved like a shadow. One by one, the outlaws dropped, 2 knifed, 1 shot, another silenced with a rope around his neck. Clara watched from the ridge, her rifle shaking in her hands. The last man tried to run. Clara stopped him. She didn't hesitate. They found her brother the next morning, tied up in an abandoned shack near the edge of Scarlet Meadows, alive but shaken. Red stood guard as Clara broke the chains and hugged him tight, tears streaking her cheeks. When it was done, Red turned to leave. "You could ride with us," she offered. "We're heading to Ansburg, got family up there. You could rest, be safe." Red shook his head. "Safe ain't for men like me." "But why?" she asked. "You did good." He mounted his horse. "I did what I had to." As he rode off, she called after him. "You think being alone makes you strong? That's what they want you to believe. But you're not done, Red. Not yet." Red spent the next winter in the wilds above Bacchus Station, where the snow muffled gunfire and time moved slow. He thought about Clara more than he cared to admit. Her words had stuck. So had the fire in her eyes. He wasn't a hero. He never would be. But maybe he could still matter. It wasn't long before others came looking. First, it was a gang of bounty hunters, sent by someone who wanted the artifact Red had buried years ago. They tracked him to a frozen creek and demanded he hand it over. Red said nothing. The fight was over in 20 seconds. Then came a man in black, smooth-talking and well-groomed, who claimed to be from the Bureau of Investigation. He introduced himself as Milton. "We're interested in the future," Milton said. "You're part of the past, but maybe you can help shape what comes next." Red narrowed his eyes. "You work with Dutch van der Linde?" Milton smiled. "I study him, and men like you help me understand him." Red walked away. Milton didn't follow, but Red knew the government wasn't done with him. Not yet. By spring, Red passed through Horseshoe Overlook and left something behind, a folded map marked with a symbol, the two-halved artifact, sketched carefully by hand. He didn't know who would find it. Maybe Arthur Morgan. Maybe no one. But it didn't matter. He was drawing a line between what had been and what might come next. In Saint Denis, months later, a gang member named Charles Smith would overhear a story in a saloon. An old bounty hunter up north who moved like a ghost and killed like thunder. A man who once buried a governor and walked away from power. Charles would write about it in his journal. Arthur would read it, and Dutch, upon hearing the name, would grow quiet. "Red Harlow," he'd say. "A man who couldn't be bought. Shame, really. He could have been part of something greater." But Red wasn't interested in something greater. He was interested in something right. And that made all the difference. Chapter 6, Fractured Loyalty. The world was unraveling. The spring of 1899 brought more than just wildflowers and thunderclouds. It brought war. Dutch van der Linde's gang was fraying at the edges. The law was tightening. Pinkertons moved like ticks in the tall grass, whispering promises and drawing steel behind smiles. And somewhere out there, in the woods and ridges between tall trees and taller lies, a name kept resurfacing. Red Harlow. Most hadn't seen him in years, but legends don't die quietly. Arthur Morgan didn't believe in fairy tales, but he'd been hearing the stories too often to ignore. Trappers in the north spoke of a man who could shoot the wings off a crow from half a mile away. Children in mining camps whispered about a fire-eyed rider who once killed 20 men over one piece of gold. And one night, in a saloon near Van Horn, an old woman claimed she'd once been saved by Harlow himself. "More shadow than man," she said. "Eyes like dying stars." Arthur just grunted and drank his whiskey. But later in camp, he asked Charles, "You ever hear of this Red Harlow fella?" Charles nodded slowly. "I did. Man like that, he doesn't die easy." Arthur looked toward the fire. Dutch was pacing, murmuring to Hosea about plans and banks and bold futures. But Arthur wasn't listening. Not really. He was thinking about ghosts. Up in the woods near Butcher Creek, Red Harlow tracked a stranger. He'd been following him for days, watched him beat a homesteader for late payments, then torch a barn to send a message. Red didn't know his name, didn't need to. He recognized the uniform, private contractor, likely working with the Bureau now, one of Milton's dogs. The man was cruel, efficient, and loud. Red waited until the rain came, the kind of rain that drowns footprints and muffles guilt. He approached the campfire slowly, revolver drawn. "I know who you are," the man said, not looking up. "They say you're dead." Red stepped into the firelight. "They say a lot of things." "You can't stop it," the man muttered. "The West's already lost. Your time's done." Red shot him clean through the eye. "No," he said, "it's just changed." Far to the west, in Shady Bell, Dutch scribbled furiously in a worn leather journal. He'd sent men looking for something. A map, one with an old symbol on it, two interlocking shapes, almost ancient in design. Found in Horseshoe Overlook, left behind like a breadcrumb. Dutch recognized it. He'd seen it once before, long ago, when he met a younger Red Harlow in the woods near Roanoke Ridge. He remembered how calm Red had been, how clear, a man without chaos. It had terrified Dutch. Now he wanted it. "Control the story and you control the future," Dutch muttered, drawing the artifact symbol again and again. Arthur saw the madness creeping in. He watched Dutch talk more and listen less. The old dream of freedom had turned sour. Gold and grand gestures, not justice, filled Dutch's sermons now. One night, Arthur asked Hosea, "What if we're chasing a ghost?" Hosea sighed. "I think maybe we are, one with a gun." Milton noticed it too. The Bureau had intercepted journal pages, old sketches, and reports of sightings. He called in Ross. "Harlow's still alive," Milton said, "and he's watching everything." Ross grinned. "Well, let's find him. If he's as dangerous as they say, he could help us crush Dutch's gang. Or better yet, flush him out." Milton shook his head. "Harlow doesn't work for anyone. He's not a pawn. He's a relic. But if we play it right, maybe we can make the pieces dance around him." Red didn't want any part of the war coming. He'd buried his guns too many times already. But Clara Wright found him again near Lake Isabella, riding hard with news that twisted his stomach. "The Bureau took my brother," she said. "Said he was conspiring with known outlaws. I told them he wasn't. I begged." Red stared at the frozen lake. "They wouldn't listen," she whispered. Red looked back at her. "I will." 2 weeks later, a Pinkerton safe house outside Annesburg exploded into fire and screams. Clara's brother was freed. The Bureau never got a look at the attacker, just a silver revolver casing left behind, engraved with the letters RH. Ross picked it up later and smiled. "Ghost left his calling card," he muttered. Milton stared into the flames, jaw clenched. "He's not just a ghost. He's a fuse, and someone's about to light him." Back in camp, Dutch grew more obsessed. The map, the symbols, the whispers. He told Arthur they had to find the place Red Harlow once buried the truth of the old world, that the artifact held something bigger than gold, power, something ancient. Arthur didn't believe in relics, but he believed Dutch had lost himself, and he started to wonder if the man they were chasing wasn't just a legend, but a warning. In the months to come, as Dutch's gang fell apart and Arthur's body withered under the weight of illness and doubt, the stories of Red Harlow became more than campfire tales. They became prophecy. A man who couldn't be corrupted. A man who saw what the world was becoming and walked away. A man who tried to stop it all before it was too late. And somewhere out there, beyond the hills and blood-stained roads, Red Harlow loaded his revolver, saddled his horse, and watched the smoke rise over a dying west. He knew what was coming. He'd seen it before. Chapter 7. Thunder always comes before lightning. Red Harlow had always believed the past was something you buried, but the Bureau had dug it back up, and now it was screaming. It started with a name. Clara Wright had brought it to him in a crumpled letter she'd stolen from a Pinkerton officer's satchel. A name Red hadn't heard in decades. Griffin Industries. It was the name of the shell company that had funded the Cobra mining operation, the one behind his parents' death. Thought to be gone like its founder, Governor Griffin. But something had survived, an offshoot of the Bureau, a private division, and they'd named it Project Red. Red didn't flinch, but something cracked behind his eyes. He rode south, through Roanoke Ridge, through Annesburg, past the mines now run dry, and into the scarred lands around Lemoyne. The Bureau's trail led to a facility hidden in the swamps near Lagras, disguised as an old lumber operation. Inside, Red found the truth. Files, artifacts, notes about the Aztec relic he'd once buried. They had studied it, obsessed over it, not for history's sake, but for the myth they believed it carried. The idea that whoever held it could bend men's will. Not magic, symbolism, power through legend, and Red was part of it. In a steel cabinet, he found a dossier titled Harlow, Subject 0. He read the words slowly. Mythologized subject, early cowboy-era folk hero, status unknown, credited with ending the Diego Calloway ring, Griffin dynasty, no known political alignment. considered too volatile for recruitment, monitored via field reports and civilian sightings, artifact connection probable. Under that, another file, Arthur Morgan. It was thinner, marked watch list. Not a threat yet. Red stared at the name. He didn't know the man, but the face in the sketch reminded him of someone younger, someone still standing on the edge of becoming something more. By morning, the compound was ash. Red walked away without looking back, just like he always had. But this time, the fire didn't feel clean. It felt hollow. Across the country, Arthur Morgan was coughing up blood behind a pine tree in the high country. He stared down at the red flecks on his sleeve, heart hammering. His lungs were losing the war. The gang was in pieces. Hosea gone. Lenny gone. Abigail was missing. John was in chains. And Dutch. Dutch was a ghost inside his own body now. All charm and thunder, but no soul. Arthur sat at camp and read Charles' notes again, scribbled entries about Red Harlow, sketches of the symbol Arthur had found on that torn piece of map, a relic, a name. He didn't know why he cared, but something about Harlow stuck with him. Like a man Arthur could have become if he'd made different choices, if he'd walked away earlier, if he'd been faster with his gun or slower with his rage. Like a warning in human form. Dutch, meanwhile, was speaking in riddles. They were in Beaver Hollow now, hiding in caves like animals, and Dutch's eyes burned with new light. He walked away from this world, Arthur, Dutch said. Red Harlow. They say he gave it all up. Power, money, glory, a fool. But I see it different. Arthur watched him from across the fire. I think he took power, Dutch whispered. The kind of power that makes empires afraid. The Bureau's still chasing his ghost, and we were following in his footsteps. Arthur said nothing. But in his heart, he was already walking away. Milton was furious. The Lagros facility had been his. Years of data, dozens of buried truths, gone in one night. He made a mistake, Ross said. Burning it down, that was emotional, reckless. Milton shook his head. No, that was a message. They poured resources into tracking Red, but he was smoke on the wind. No trail, no pattern, just occasional whispers. A train robbery foiled single-handedly in New Hanover. A band of mercenaries found tied to trees in Cumberland Forest. A Pinkerton informant left bleeding near the Dakota River, holding a note that read, "You've already lost." And then came word from Blackwater. A ferry job gone wrong, blood in the water, civilians dead. The Vander Linde gang had finally made their mistake. Milton saw his opening. We get Dutch, we get everything. But what Milton didn't realize was this. Red Harlow wasn't just cleaning up the past. He was setting the table for the next storm. That winter, Red came down from the mountains. He met with Clara one last time. You can't stop all of this, she said. They're too big now, too connected. I know, he said. Then why keep fighting? Red holstered his revolver. Because somewhere out there, there's someone who still needs a way out. And if I can't give them that, then all I ever did was bury bodies. She grabbed his hand. You gave me more than that, he smiled. Maybe that's enough. The last anyone saw of Red Harlow, he was riding west, toward the dying sun, alone again. But in the hills behind him, in the minds of outlaws and lawmen alike, his name echoed louder than ever. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a line in the sand. And across that line came Arthur Morgan. Chapter 8. Shattered Visions. The moon hung heavy over the trees, casting long, jagged shadows across the campfire. The crackle of the flames was the only sound breaking the stillness of the night, a stark contrast to the rising tension in the air. Dutch sat across from Arthur, his eyes gleaming with the fevered light of a man on the verge of something great, or something disastrous. You don't see it, Arthur, Dutch said, his voice quiet but insistent. Red Harlow, that man understood what I've always known. The system will fall, the government will fall, and when it does, the true men of the land will rise. Arthur stared into the fire, the heat of it in his face, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Red Harlow, the name burned into his mind like a brand. He hadn't seen the man himself, but every tale he heard felt like a prophecy, a warning wrapped in myth. Arthur had started to wonder if Dutch wasn't trying to be Red, if he wasn't looking for the same kind of power the old bounty hunter had once possessed. But Arthur wasn't sure he could keep following a man who had already started to fall apart. You don't get it, Dutch, Arthur said, his voice rough, tired. This ain't the world you think it is anymore. We're running from shadows, chasing ghosts. Red Harlow's ghost, if you want to get specific. I've heard the stories, and I'm starting to think maybe he was right. Dutch stiffened, his eyes narrowing. You're starting to sound like them, Arthur. The law, the bureau. They're feeding you lies, and now you're starting to believe them. Arthur shook his head, standing up abruptly. No, I'm not. I'm just seeing things clearer. I think maybe it's time to stop running. We're on the losing side of history, Dutch. Dutch's face twisted in anger, and for a moment it felt like the campfire itself had caught the heat of his fury. You think you know better than me, Arthur? His voice was low but cutting, a cold promise lacing each word. Red Harlow was just a man. He had his chance, and he threw it away. But I'm not him. I'm going to make sure we're not forgotten. We're going to carve our place in this world. Arthur felt the weight of Dutch's words like a pressure on his chest, suffocating him. He had been with Dutch for so long, longer than he could remember, and the idea of walking away, of leaving it all behind, felt impossible. But Red's shadow loomed larger every day, and the longer he stayed, the more he realized Dutch's vision had nothing to do with freedom and everything to do with control. Red Harlow's name had started appearing again, this time not in whispers, but in reports. The Bureau, now actively hunting the remnants of the Vanderlinde gang, was tracing Red's steps more seriously than ever. There were rumors that he had destroyed several of their operations. Pinkertons who had been out in the field tracking outlaws reported strange encounters, gunmen who appeared out of nowhere, their faces hidden in the darkness of night. But Red had been a ghost for years. How could a man like him be so elusive, even to the law? And yet, the reports were clear. He was still out there, pulling strings, leaving his mark on the land. The Pinkertons were starting to panic. Meanwhile, Arthur began to realize that Red was more than a name in a newspaper. The man had been a symbol of something deeper, something more tragic. A man who fought not for riches, but for balance in a world out of control. Arthur couldn't help but think of what Red had walked away from, the quest for vengeance, the cycle of blood. Red had carved a name out of pain, but when that name had been written, it had been buried with it. And here was Dutch, still chasing the dream of empire, as though he had never learned the lesson that Red had already taught. Arthur found himself alone on the banks of the Dakota River late one night, his mind tangled in these thoughts. The last few months had been a blur of violence, betrayal, and loss. He had seen men die, good men, bad men, men who were nothing more than ghosts in the end. Dutch had led them down this path, but he wasn't the one paying the price. Arthur was, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could ignore the voice in his head telling him to stop following, to stop believing that Dutch could lead them out of this mess. He thought about Red again, how the man had walked away when everything around him crumbled. Red had known the truth of the land. It wasn't about the fight for a piece of it, or the dreams of glory. It was about knowing when to walk away, and Arthur couldn't ignore that truth anymore. The next morning, Dutch called a meeting. "We need to move. The Bureau's closing in," Dutch said, the tension in his voice thick with urgency. "We can't let them take everything we've built." Arthur met his gaze, the old flame of loyalty flickering in his chest. He had always trusted Dutch, always believed in him. But now, the weight of that belief felt like a heavy chain around his neck. "I think it's time we talk about a different path," Arthur said, his voice calm but firm. "We don't have to keep running, Dutch. We can let it go." Dutch stared at him, eyes cold with disbelief. "Let it go?" he spat. "You want to let everything we fought for just slip away?" Arthur stood his ground. "I'm not saying give up. I'm saying we stop chasing ghosts. We stop running for something that's never going to happen. We've got a chance to build something real, Dutch." For a long moment, Dutch said nothing, his gaze flickering with something darker, deeper than Arthur had seen before. Finally he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You think Red Harlow was a hero, Arthur? A legend? No. He was a coward. He left when the fight got hard. And you?" Dutch's voice broke, trembling with fury. "You want to be just like him?" Arthur felt the sting of those words like a slap across the face. "I'm not like him, Dutch, but I know what it means to fight for something that's worth it, and I don't think this gang is worth fighting for anymore." The silence that followed felt like the calm before the storm. Dutch's eyes locked onto Arthur's, and in that moment, the weight of all their years together seemed to come crashing down. Dutch opened his mouth, but no words came out. Arthur turned and walked away. In the hills outside the camp, a rider appeared in the distance. Red Harlow, or rather, his name. His story had led Arthur here, to this moment. The winds of change were coming, and the ghosts of the past were rising again. Chapter 9. Into the Storm. The night was alive with the crackle of distant thunder, the wind cutting through the trees like a warning. The sky above was a tapestry of bruised clouds, the air heavy with the scent of rain. In the distance, the low rumble of a storm stirred the ground, as if the land itself knew what was coming. Dutch van der Linde sat alone by the fire, his fingers trembling as they tapped against the worn leather of his journal. His mind raced, but the words on the page never seemed to come together. The chaos inside him was becoming a mirror of the world outside, broken, scattered, and on the verge of collapse. Arthur Morgan stood at the edge of the camp, looking down at the quiet, murky waters of the river. His chest tightened with every breath he took. His body ached, his spirit more so. The sickness had taken root deeper than he cared to admit, but it was his soul that was most broken. The doubts that had once whispered in the corners of his mind now rang loud and clear. He had seen it, the same darkness that had claimed Dutch, and now it was creeping into him too. The question that lingered was simple. Was it too late to stop it? He couldn't shake the image of Red Harlow, the man who had walked away from it all when everything crumbled. A man who had seen the truth and decided to live in it, even if it meant giving up everything he had fought for. Arthur wasn't sure if he could do the same. The gang had fractured beyond repair. Every day was a battle of survival. Survival against the law, against their own demons, and against the whispers of betrayal that had started to fester in their midst. Dutch had become a shell of the man he once was, consumed by paranoia, greed, and the delusion that the revolution was still possible. He had sunk into the madness of his own mind, believing that his vision could still be realized. But Arthur knew better now. The vision had always been a lie. Arthur looked back at the fire, where Dutch was still scribbling in his journal. The desperation in Dutch's eyes was unmistakable, but there was something else there too. A gnawing fear that Arthur hadn't seen before. A fear of losing control. Arthur had always admired Dutch's charisma, his ability to inspire men to follow him, to believe in something greater than themselves. But now Arthur saw it for what it was, a farce. A fragile, crumbling empire held together by broken promises and a shared addiction to chaos. It was time to leave. Arthur had made his decision. He didn't know where he would go, but he knew it wasn't with Dutch. It wasn't with the gang anymore. He could feel the storm coming, the storm that Red Harlow had known all too well, the storm that would cleanse everything, but leave only ruin in its wake. Elsewhere, in the deep swamps of Lemoyne, Red Harlow was still a ghost. The fires had long burned out in the camps and towns he had once torn through. The wreckage he had left behind, both literal and emotional, had faded into the landscape, and with it the bloodstains. But the stories persisted. His name lingered in the whispers of those who had survived the hell he had unleashed upon the world. But Red had gone quiet. For months, he had wandered the empty lands, searching for something that he could never find. He had watched the world change, the end of an era taking shape before his very eyes, and he had begun to question whether there was still anything worth saving. He had left the war long ago, but the war had never really left him. The law was closing in, and he knew it. He had seen the same tired faces, the same false promises. The Bureau was relentless, a machine with no soul, no honor. They had taken everything from him, his parents, his home, his peace. But now they were after something else, something deeper. And Red knew that he could stop them. He was the last man who still understood how to fight the system. Back in camp, Dutch had finally noticed that Arthur had been distant for days, his eyes cold and withdrawn. It wasn't just the sickness, Dutch realized. Something had shifted, something had broken. "Arthur," Dutch called, his voice thin, strained. "We have to move fast. I've got a plan, and it's the only way out. The money's close, but we need to act now." Arthur stood, his face set in a grim expression. He didn't respond right away, but when he did, It wasn't the words Dutch had been expecting. "I'm not going with you, Dutch," Arthur said quietly. "I can't. I won't." Dutch's face twisted in disbelief. "What are you talking about? You're the one who's always been with me, always." Arthur's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of everything he'd sacrificed, everything he'd believed in, coming crashing down. "It was never about loyalty, Dutch. Not really. It was about the dream. But the dream's gone. You're gone. And I can't follow you into that madness anymore." The silence between them was deafening. Dutch's eyes grew wild, desperate, and in that moment, Arthur saw the man that Red Harlow had once recognized, the one who had clung to a fading vision of glory, even as everything around him fell apart. Dutch stood up abruptly, his eyes flashing with rage. "You're making a mistake, Arthur. A huge mistake. You'll regret this." Arthur didn't flinch. "I won't." He turned and walked away from the fire, his boots heavy on the earth, the weight of his decision settling deep inside him. The sound of Dutch's voice shouting his name echoed in the distance, but Arthur kept walking. Red Harlow had been watching from a distance. He had seen the fire in Arthur's eyes, the same fire that once burned in his own, and now he knew it was time. Arthur didn't know it yet, but they were bound by more than just the past. Their paths were about to cross again, and this time it wouldn't be for the sake of revenge, it would be for survival. The storm broke the following night. The van der Linde gang, in their final, desperate push to escape, would make their last stand. Arthur, standing on the precipice of his own redemption, would face his greatest trial yet. And somewhere in the shadows, Red Harlow's legacy would rise once more. Chapter 10, Harlow's Final Reckoning. The storm had come. It roared through the mountain passes, shaking the trees and bending the earth with every flash of lightning. Dutch's camp was nothing but a ruin now, a fractured shell of what it had once been. What was once a dream of freedom, a vision of a new world, was now nothing more than a fading echo. The van der Linde gang had come undone. Arthur Morgan stood at the edge of camp, his body aching with the weight of everything he had just lost. The cold rain lashed against his face, mixing with the salt of his own sweat and blood. His sickness had worsened, but it didn't matter now. The gang was finished, Dutch was finished, and he had to face that truth. He looked at the old, tattered flag they had once carried with pride, now shredded by the storm. Everything was broken. But in that brokenness, Arthur felt something stir. It wasn't hope. It wasn't fear, it was clarity. The fire had burned itself out long ago, and what remained was the cold wind of truth. Dutch had fallen, and for better or worse, Arthur had to decide whether to keep fighting for a dream that had died long ago, or to walk away. The truth was that he was tired of the violence, tired of the lies, tired of running, and most of all, he was tired of watching good men and women die for nothing. But before Arthur could make his final choice, he heard the sound of hooves in the distance. He turned sharply, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. His heart skipped a beat when he saw who it was. Red Harlow. The man had appeared like a shadow out of the storm. His figure was unmistakable, tall, hard, and weary, a man forged by loss, by vengeance, and by the kind of survival that only the most ruthless could understand. But as Red dismounted, Arthur felt something shift in the air. Red wasn't here to fight. He wasn't here for vengeance. He was here because the game was over. "Arthur Morgan," Red said, his voice as rough as the terrain they stood on. "Been a long time, hasn't it?" Arthur said nothing at first, his gaze hardening as he sized up the man before him. Red's face was older than he remembered, etched with lines of pain, of years spent in the margins of society. But there was also something in his eyes, something familiar. "You're the one they call the Ghost," Arthur muttered, almost to himself. Red nodded slowly. "I've been a lot of things over the years. Ghost, outlaw, hunter, but right now I'm just a man who's seen this all before." Arthur stepped forward, his hand still on the grip of his revolver. "You here to finish it? To finish what Dutch started?" Red shook his head. Dutch doesn't know what he's doing anymore. The dream he's chasing isn't the one I fought for. It's just madness." Arthur's throat tightened. He had spent so much of his life following Dutch, believing in the vision he sold. And now, standing in front of the man who had walked away from it all, Arthur realized just how far they had fallen. "So what now?" Arthur asked, his voice low, weary. The gang's done for. Dutch has lost his mind. All this fight, what's it for? Red looked out toward the mountains, his eyes distant. It's for something better, Arthur. But not this. Not this chaos. There was a long silence between them as the storm raged on. It was as if the world itself had paused, waiting for the next move. Finally, Red spoke again, his voice softer now. You know, I used to think that revenge was the answer, that killing Griffin and all those men would somehow set things right, but it didn't. It just made more ghosts, more blood. I walked away because I realized that life isn't about who you kill, but who you protect, who you leave behind. Arthur felt his chest tighten. And you think that's what's left for me? To walk away from it all. Red looked at him, his gaze sharp but not unkind. You've got a choice, Arthur. Walk away now, while you still can. The world you've known is dead. Dutch's vision is over. The law's on your heels. They're coming for you and everyone in this gang. Arthur felt his heart sink, the weight of those words bearing down on him. As the hours passed, the gang's final moments were coming to an inevitable end. Dutch, frantic and cornered, continued to lash out at everyone around him, convinced that one last grand robbery would fix everything. But deep down, he knew it was a lie. The men and women who had once followed Dutch now felt the sting of betrayal and despair. John Marston, Abigail, and even Micah Bell all had their own reasons for seeking a way out, but none were stronger than the need to survive. When the Pinkertons finally arrived, it wasn't with the storm they had expected. It was a slow, drawn-out ambush that engulfed them all. Gunfire erupted as Dutch, Micah, and the last of the gang fought tooth and nail, but there was no escape now. The dream had finally died. Arthur watched from a distance as the chaos unfolded, unable to intervene. He had already made his choice. And as the Pinkertons closed in, Red gave Arthur one last look. Go, while you still have a chance. There's a place for you beyond all this. Find it. And with that, Red disappeared into the shadows. The next morning, Arthur was alone. The gang had been scattered to the winds, their bodies left in the mud, a testament to their failures. Dutch was gone, lost to the storm of his own madness. Micah, the last thread holding the gang together, had vanished into the hills, knowing full well that the law was closing in on him. Arthur had nothing left. His health was failing, his body broken, and the world around him was gone. He felt Red's words echoing in his mind. The life he had known was over, but the future was still unwritten. A year later, Arthur Morgan would find himself on a dusty trail near Blackwater, alone but not quite defeated. The story of the Vanderlinde gang would be one of legend, of a failed dream and a man who had tried to build something better out of chaos. But the remnants of that story, the decisions made, the betrayals, the bloodshed, would live on. Arthur's name too would be remembered, but it wouldn't be in the way Dutch had hoped. He had walked away from the war, not to escape, but to build something different. Not revenge, not violence, but redemption. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring or how long he had left. But for the first time in his life, he understood what Red Harlow had known all along. Some ghosts never die, but that doesn't mean they have to define you. As the winds of change swept across the land, the world would turn its eyes toward a new horizon. And a young man named John Marston would find himself caught in a new storm. But that, as they say, is another story. With that, Red Harlow Story came full circle. His choices, his legacy, his sacrifice, all tied into the end of the Vanderlinde gang. Arthur Morgan would go on to carve his own path, still haunted by the past, but not defined by it. The stage was set for the events of Red Dead Redemption 2 to unfold, as the end of one era gave way to the birth of another.